Regina Vance wasn't a businesswoman. She was the kind of woman whose name made people lower their voices in restaurants. The kind whose silence could empty a room faster than a loaded weapon. She ran half of Chicago's underworld from behind a mahogany desk in a room her own staff called the Vault. And she wore her power the way other women wore perfume, naturally, permanently, and as a warning you could smell before she even walked in. She'd buried her husband 11 months ago. Not from illness, not from an accident. 3 bullets on a sidewalk meant for her. And Carter had turned his body into a shield for their 13-day-old son. The baby survived with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. Carter didn't survive at all, and whatever part of Regina Vance had been capable of softness died. Right there on the concrete next to him. She loved her son Nolan with the kind of ferocity that frightened even her closest men. But she loved him the way a woman watches a flame through bulletproof glass. Convinced that getting close enough to feel the warmth would somehow be the thing that snuffed it out. Then Sam Mercer showed up. A former male nurse who'd been fired for a mistake that wasn't his. Carrying a debt that wasn't his either, left behind by a wife who disappeared into her own cowardice like smoke through a crack in the door. He arrived at the Vance estate in an 8-year-old car with 1 bag in the trunk. A daughter named Jenna who hadn't smiled in 6 months and watched every room like she was mapping the exits, and a son named Benny who dragged a beat-up one-eared stuffed rabbit called Mabel everywhere he went and had once tried to sing a lullaby to a stray cat on a fire escape because had decided it looked sad. Sam didn't know the men in suits at the gate weren't security guards. He didn't know the house he'd moved his children into was a fortress built on blood. All he knew was that every other door in the city had closed. And this was the only one still open. And when you've got 2 kids and nowhere left to go, you don't ask what's behind the door. You just walk through it. But hey, race what nobody saw coming. Every night after the house went dark, Benny climbed out of bed in his star pajamas, grabbed Mabel by her one good ear, and took his sister's hand, and the 2 of them walked barefoot through the corridors of a Mafia boss mansion to the nursery where baby Nolan had been crying himself to sleep every night since the day his father died. Benny sang to him some made-up song, tuneless and gentle, and so painfully sincere it could split you right open. He tucked the blanket around Nolan's middle the way he'd seen adults do lopsided, too enthusiastic, absolutely perfect. And Jenna. Jenna didn't sing. Jenna sat with her back against the wall next to the door, Mabel across her lap like a sentry's rifle. And she kept watch. Not because anyone told her to, because that's what Jenna had done every single night since her mother walked out. She guarded the people she loved. And she decided that was her job now. And she wasn't going to stop just because the house had gotten bigger and the hallways had gotten darker. 23 nights. That's how long Regina let the footage pile up before she finally watched it. 23 nights. Her son had slept through till morning. The same son who hadn't made it through a single night since his father was killed. And the reason wasn't a new nanny or medication or any of the expensive solutions she'd thrown at the problem. It was a little boy in star pajamas, a stuffed rabbit with 1 ear, and a girl who refused to sleep until her brother's work was done. Now, if that hasn't already grabbed you by the chest, hold on, because what Regina Vance did after she watched that footage changed everything for everyone in that house, and not in any of the ways you're expecting. If this story is already making you feel something, hit that like button, share it with someone who could use a good story tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Now, let's go back to the moment Regina Vance slid a photograph across her desk and said the last thing her housekeeper ever expected to hear from the most dangerous woman in Chicago. Sam Mercer had never stepped into that room before. In the 3 months he had worked at the Vance estate, he had mopped every hallway floor, polished every surface, washed every silk bed sheet. He was certain cost more than the rent on his old apartment. But the vault was different. The vault was the room that even Paul, the head butler who had served the Vance family for 20 years, entered only when his name was called. The black oak door was so heavy that Sam had to use both hands to push it. And when it opened, what struck him wasn't the light, but the absence of it. The curtains were drawn shut. A single table lamp cast a yellow glow across a mahogany desk so white it looked less like a desk than a place of judgment. The room smelled of leather, old whiskey, and something else Sam couldn't name, though his instincts recognized it at once. It was the smell of power, the kind that thickened the air and tightened his chest before he even understood why. Regina Vance sat behind the desk. She didn't look up. Her right hand held a pen, her eyes fixed on the document in front of her. Her jaw set in a straight line sharp as a blade. Sam stood in the middle of the room, both hands twisted tight in the edge of his apron, and waited. The silence stretched on. Not the comfortable kind of silence between people who know each other. This was the kind of silence with weight. The kind that settled on someone's shoulders until they spoke the thing they were hiding. Sam had seen this kind of silence before in the emergency room when the attending physician wanted the training nurse to confess a mistake. But that time he had lost his career. This time he could lose more. Losing his job meant leaving the estate. Leaving the estate meant having no address. Having no address meant Kane Preston and his lone shark crew would find him within a week. And this time they wouldn't just call and make threats. Ms. Vance, I swear to you, I don't know how they got in, Sam said, and his voice came out thinner than he wanted, shakier than he allowed. I locked their room every night. I checked twice. Benny was asleep when I left the room. Every time. I don't understand why he keeps. Regina still didn't look up. The pen was still in her hand. The document was still in front of her, but Sam realized she wasn't reading. Her eyes weren't moving. She was listening and she was waiting for him to finish so she could say the thing she had already prepared. I installed an electronic lock on my son's room, she said, her voice low and flat as the mahogany surface before her. A 6-digit code changed every day. Explain to me how 2 children, one 5 years old and one 3 years old, managed to get past it. Sam opened his mouth, but no words came out. He thought of Benny, tiny in his star-printed pajamas, curls tousled from sleep, Mabel tucked under one arm, and he couldn't, no matter how hard he tried, picture his son breaking an electronic lock, but he couldn't explain it either. I'll move the children to a room in the farthest wing, Sam said quickly, his voice catching. Downstairs if I have to. I'll talk to them. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Please don't. He stopped, swallowing the rest of the sentence because saying it aloud would make the fear real. Please don't throw us out. Regina Vance finally looked up in those pale gray eyes, the eyes Sam had avoided looking into directly for 3 months out of the same instinct that makes people avoid staring into the sun, held no anger. They held no warmth either. They held something he couldn't read. A careful stillness, like the surface of a frozen lake when you have no idea how deep the water runs beneath it. I didn't say I was throwing you out, Carter. She paused. Sam. She corrected herself, and the flicker of confusion that crossed her face was so quick that Sam wasn't sure he had really seen it. I said, I don't understand. There's a difference. Then she opened the desk drawer, pulled out a photograph printed on ordinary paper, black and white, grainy, the kind of image you get from a night vision camera, and set it in the middle of the mahogany desk before sliding it toward Sam with 2 fingers. Sam stepped forward and picked up the photograph with both trembling hands. Grainy, black, and white. The infrared glow laid a veil over everything like dream fog. But Sam recognized it instantly. Recognized it even before his mind could catch up because a father's heart doesn't need high resolution to know his own child. Benny. His son stood beside the crib. Both tiny hands gripping the rail, his head tilted to one side, his mouth open, and Sam knew exactly what he was doing, even though the photograph had no sound. That tilt of the head, that little round open mouth, that solemn look of concentration so serious it was almost funny on the face of a 3-year-old. That was Benny when he sang. Benny sang to everything. To toy cars, to shoes, to the ants crawling across the windowsill of their old apartment on the south side of the city. And now, apparently to Regina Vance's 11-month-old baby. But the thing that made Sam lift a hand to cover his mouth wasn't Benny. It was Jenna. His daughter sat on the floor beside the bedroom door, her back straight against the wall, her legs stretched out in front of her. And on her lap was Mabel, Benny's one-eared stuffed rabbit that Benny never let go of. Jenna was holding Mabel, but she wasn't asleep. Her eyes were open, staring straight into the darkness of the hallway ahead, and Sam understood. He understood at once with the painful understanding of a father who had watched his daughter change after the day her mother disappeared. 6 months earlier, when Tricia picked up her backpack and walked out the door for the last time without looking back, Jenna had stood at the window watching her until her mother's figure was completely gone. Then she turned, walked straight to Benny's room, sat down beside her brother's bed, and didn't leave until morning. From that night on, she hadn't cried once, hadn't asked where Mommy was once. She had simply and quietly assigned herself a duty no 5-year-old child should ever have to carry to protect her little brother, protect her father, protect anyone she decided belonged to her. And she did it with the silent, merciless seriousness of someone who had learned that grown-ups can disappear at any moment. "There's more," Regina said. Her voice was lower than before. She turned the laptop on the desk toward Sam and pressed play. The video was 2 minutes and 11 seconds long. In it, Benny climbed over the lone nursery gate with extraordinary care for a 3-year-old, one step at a time, one finger at a time, so slowly that Sam held his breath, even though he knew his son had clearly done this 23 times without a scratch. Benny crossed the wooden floor on bare feet to Nolan's crib, rose up on tiptoe, and slipped his little hand through the slats to place it over Nolan's even smaller one. The baby was fussing, his legs kicking. But the moment Benny touched him, Nolan stopped completely, as if someone had flipped off a switch no nanny had been able to find in 11 months. Then Benny began to sing. And while Benny sang, Jenna sat by the door holding Mabel and did something Sam had never realized until he saw it on the screen. Every few seconds, she turned her head to look down the hallway, sweeping the darkness with the eyes of a child already used to checking whether someone was coming. Then she looked back at Benny, making sure he was safe. Then she looked at the hallway again, then back at Benny. 2 directions, constantly. She was guarding her brother and guarding the entrance at the same time. And she did it with the steady, instinctive rhythm of someone who had practiced this every night for 6 months. On the screen, Benny pulled his hand back, tugged up the corner of Nolan's blue blanket to cover the baby's belly the way he had seen grown-ups do it. Crooked, far too eager, one side hanging down by nearly a handspan, while the other side barely covered anything at all. Then he laid his palm flat against Nolan's back, leaving it there, warm and steady, and kept singing. Nolan fell asleep. Benny stayed standing there for another minute, simply standing, watching Nolan's chest rise and fall as if he were confirming that the job was done and the baby would be all right until morning. Then he turned, went back to Jenna, and Jenna stood, placed Mabel in her brother's hands, and the 2 children left the room hand in hand. Benny walking first, Jenna half a step behind, their little shadows fading into the darkness of the hall. The screen went black. The video ended. Sam didn't realize he was crying until a tear fell onto the surface of the mahogany desk, and he flinched at the sound of it in the suffocating stillness of the room. He lifted his head and looked at Regina Vance and saw that she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the final frame frozen on the laptop screen, the image of her son lying in his crib, his chest rising and falling in the pale dark, deeply asleep, knowing nothing of the tiny angel who came to visit him every night and quietly slipped away before dawn. Regina's throat moved once, only once. Then she closed the laptop slowly, folded her hands in front of her, and stared into the empty space in the middle of the room for so long that Sam thought she had forgotten he was standing there. But she hadn't. She was allowing something to move behind those pale gray eyes. Something Sam had never seen on the face of a woman like her. Something that looked like pain trying to shift aside to make room for something else. 23 nights, she said, and her voice had changed now. Something had been stripped away, and something raw and bare underneath had been exposed. I checked the entire archive. Nolan slept through the night for 23 nights in a row. She stopped. Before that, he hadn't slept through a single night. Not one night since his father died. Sam stood there with tears still wet on his cheeks and couldn't find words big enough for that moment. 11 months. An 11-month-old baby had cried through 11 months of nights, and 3 nannies had come and gone, and medications had been prescribed and changed, and nothing had worked until a 3-year-old boy in star-printed pajamas decided that the baby at the end of the hall needed someone, and he would be that someone. "I'm sorry, Ms. Vance," Sam said, his voice breaking. "I'm truly sorry. I'll talk to the children tonight. I'll stop them. I'll lock. Don't. One word." Sam stopped in the middle of the sentence. "Don't stop them." Regina still wasn't looking at him. She was looking down at her folded hands. Hands Sam was certain had done things he didn't want to know about. And now they were laced together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "The girl," she said, and her voice was almost a whisper. "Jenna. The girl sits watch at the door. 5 years old. She doesn't sing. She doesn't sleep. She sits there holding her brother's rabbit and keeps watch until he's done. And only then does she leave." She lifted her eyes to Sam. "I have 14 bodyguards in this house. 14 grown men who are paid to keep everything inside these 4 walls safe. Not one of them has done what your daughter does every night." The room was so silent that Sam could hear the clock on the wall behind Regina. Tick, tick, tick. Steady and indifferent, as if time didn't care that something was breaking apart and setting itself back together inside the chest of the woman sitting behind that mahogany desk. Regina looked at him, and for the first time in 3 months, Sam saw something other than perfectly controlled coldness. He saw a crack, small but real. "My little boy needed someone," she said. Her voice was barely louder than breathing. A 3-year-old child saw that. "He goes into that room every night, sings to my son, tucks the blanket around him, stands there watching him breathe, and then leaves. And his sister keeps watch outside the door because she doesn't trust a single adult in this house to do it for him." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. She was right. She said it. And those 2 words carried the weight of 11 months of sleepless nights, of 3 bodyguards rotating shifts outside the baby's room every night, while not one of them thought to do the simplest thing: walk into the room and sing. Of a mother who loved her son enough to kill for him, but didn't know how to sit down beside his crib and stay there until he fell asleep. "My little boy needed someone, and I didn't know how to be that someone." Sam stood in the vault, the tears drying on his cheeks, looking at the most powerful woman he had ever met, admit the one thing she surely had never admitted to anyone, that she had failed at the only thing that truly mattered. And he didn't know what to say. He nodded. She nodded. And Sam left the room on trembling legs, closed the heavy black oak door behind him, and stood alone in the brightly lit hallway outside the vault with his heart pounding so hard that he had to lean back against the wall. Because he had walked into that room believing he was about to be thrown into the street with his 2 children. And he had walked out with something entirely different, something he still couldn't name. But it was heavy and warm and frightening in an entirely new way. That night at 11:47, Regina Vance did something she hadn't done in 11 months. She rose from her desk before midnight. For nearly a year, the vault had been the place where she existed after sundown, sitting beneath the murky yellow glow of the desk lamp among phone calls no one should ever hear and decisions no one should ever know about. And she stayed there until the clock struck 2, 3, sometimes 4 in the morning, because going to bed meant lying in the bed where Carter had once lain beside her. And she still hadn't figured out how to do that without feeling as though she were swallowing glass. But tonight, she switched off the desk lamp, pushed back her chair, stood up, walked out of the vault, and closed the door behind her without looking back. As if she hesitated for even 1 more second, she would change her mind and sit down again and pretend that this morning had never happened. The east hallway was long and silent. The wall lights dim and gold, and Regina passed through them with steps slower than usual, the steps of a woman walking towards something she wasn't sure she was ready for. She passed the wedding photograph hanging on the wall, Carter in his tailored suit, smiling. That smile she had once told him was the most dangerous weapon she had ever faced. And she didn't stop, but her steps slowed by half a beat as she passed it. The kind of slowing only someone watching very closely would have noticed. At the end of the hall, Nolan's bedroom door stood slightly open. And from that narrow opening, light spilled out. Not the ceiling light or a bedside lamp, but the soft golden glow of the moon-shaped nightlight Carter had bought before Nolan was born. The one Regina had nearly thrown away 3 times in the first month after he died because looking at it made her think of the afternoon Carter had placed it on the shelf and said the baby would need moonlight to sleep. Every child did. But in the end, she hadn't thrown it away because it was the last thing Carter had placed in that room with his own hands. Regina stopped outside the door. The little moon cast a narrow ribbon of light through the opening and stretched it across the wooden hallway floor. And standing there in that ribbon of light, she heard it. Benny's voice. Small, steady, an improvised song with no real words, only soft humming sounds arranged in an order only a 3-year-old could understand, and it moved through the darkness of this house too large for its own walls, like something both fragile and impossible to break. Regina leaned slightly and looked through the gap in the door. Benny stood beside the crib, his small hand still wrapped around the rail, his head tilted, singing. And on the floor by the door, in exactly the place Regina had seen on the video that morning, but now only a single step away from her, sat Jenna. The girl was sitting there, her back straight, Mabel in her lap, her eyes open, and Jenna saw her. In the darkness of the hall, through the narrow opening, the eyes of the 5-year-old found the eyes of the woman standing outside with astonishing quiet precision, as if she had known Regina was there before Regina had even arrived. The two of them looked at each other. Regina Vance, a woman whose gaze had once made gang leaders sign away territory, stood in the hallway of her own house and found herself being assessed by the unblinking eyes of a 5-year-old girl. Jenna wasn't afraid. That was the first thing Regina realized. The girl wasn't afraid of her. She looked at Regina the way she might look at a new variable in the equation she had been solving by herself every night for the past 6 months. Then Jenna nodded once briefly. Not the nod of a child greeting an adult. It was the nod of a guard allowing someone else into a protected place as if she were saying, "I see you. I know you're there. You may stand here. I allow it." Regina didn't step inside. She stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the wood, and closed her eyes. Benny sang. Nolan breathed evenly in his crib. Jenna kept watch, and Regina Vance stood there in the dark with her eyes shut, listening to the housekeeper's son sing her son to sleep. And for the first time in nearly a year, she felt something that 14 bodyguards and $1 million security system and every concrete wall she had built around herself had never been able to create. This house in this moment wasn't a fortress. It was a home. At 5 o'clock the next morning, Sam stood alone in the kitchen. And that was the part of the day he loved most. At 5 in the morning, the house belonged to him in a way it never belonged to him at any other hour. When the guards were changing shifts at the gate and Paul hadn't come downstairs yet, and the children were still asleep, the kitchen became the only place in the Vance mansion where Sam didn't feel like a housekeeper, but simply like a man making coffee in the quiet before the world woke up. He was pouring the first cup when he heard footsteps. Not Paul's footsteps, soft cloth slippers on stone, not the footsteps of a bodyguard. Heavy leather shoes, steady and exact. These were bare feet on tile, so quiet they were almost not there at all. And when Sam turned around, Regina Vance was standing in the kitchen doorway with her hair uncombed and the sleeves of her black shirt rolled to her elbows, looking like a woman who had wandered through her own house at midnight and somehow ended up here at dawn without being entirely sure why. In the 3 months Sam had worked here, Regina had never once come down to the kitchen. Paul brought coffee up to the vault every morning at 6, in the black handleless porcelain cup he said she had used since before Carter died. Meals were left outside the study door on silver trays. Regina Vance didn't come down to the kitchen because the kitchen was where Carter used to stand and cook late at night when he couldn't sleep. And everyone in the house knew that, even though no one ever said it aloud. But this morning she was standing here in the kitchen doorway. And neither she nor Sam knew quite what to do with this moment. "Coffee," she said. Not a question, but not exactly a request either. More like a word dropped into the silence to fill it. Sam nodded, turned back to the machine, and poured a second cup. He set both cups on the marble island, and they stood across from each other over the gray-white stone, drinking coffee in silence, and Sam realized this was the first time he had ever been in the same room with Regina Vance without feeling as if he were being judged or waiting to be dismissed. Then the kitchen door opened, and Benny appeared. Star pajamas, curls bursting in every direction imaginable after a night of tossing and turning. Mabel tucked beneath his right arm, the rabbit's one good ear bobbing with every step. Behind Benny, half a step back, came Jenna in navy blue sleep clothes, her hair parted to one side, her eyes already fully open and sweeping the kitchen out of instinct before landing on Regina, assessing her, then settling near the door as she stepped back half a pace and watched. Benny did not have the habit of stepping back half a pace. Benny looked at Regina, looked at the 2 coffee cups on the island, looked back at Regina, and on his little 3-year-old face came an expression of pure satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction worn by someone who sees the world arranging itself exactly the way it ought to. "You're here," Benny said. Not a question. "I'm here," Regina confirmed. Benny climbed onto the tall chair beside the island with the determination of someone conquering a mountain peak, placed Mabel solemnly on the marble surface, turned the rabbit so her face was toward Regina, then looked at her with great seriousness. "Mabel's leg hurts," Benny announced. Then he looked down at the rabbit with genuine concern, like a doctor reporting on a patient's condition. "Her ear is torn, too." She looked at Mabel. The stuffed rabbit lying on the marble kitchen counter of a Mafia boss looked pitiful in every possible sense of the word. One ear nearly torn off and hanging by a few threads, stuffing spilling from her right leg, her left eye dulled from too many nights being clutched close, and her body gone gray, even though Sam was certain she had once been white in another life. Regina looked at Mabel, then at Benny, then back at Mabel with the same expression Sam had seen her use when reviewing important documents in the vault. Serious, focused, wholly attentive. "She needs a doctor," she said. Benny nodded fiercely, clearly relieved that at last an adult understood the gravity of the situation. "Daddy said he'd sew her, but Daddy doesn't have a needle yet," Benny added, glancing at Sam with the gentle patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time. Sam opened his mouth to say something. Sorry, or an explanation, or another promise that he would mend Mabel as soon as he found a needle and thread. But Regina had already nodded to Benny with perfect gravity and said, "I'll see what I can do." And by the kitchen door, standing half a step back in her navy blue sleep clothes, Jenna watched the entire exchange with eyes that missed nothing, moving from Regina's hand when she held the cup to Regina's face when she looked at Benny to Regina's voice when she spoke about Mabel, assessing everything, noting everything, and still not yet delivering her verdict. That afternoon, when Sam led the children back for their nap, Benny had fallen asleep on his shoulder halfway down the hall, his breathing light and even, warm against Sam's neck, and Jenna walked beside them in silence, one hand holding the hem of her father's shirt out of habit, her eyes still scanning the hallway, even though at midday there was nothing to guard against except the bands of October sunlight pouring through the tall windows. Sam laid Benny down on the bed, pulled the blanket up to his son's chest, then turned toward Jenna's bed on the other side of the room and saw that the girl had already stretched herself out, her eyes closed. Mabel no longer in her lap because Mabel was lying on Benny's bed. But Sam stopped short in the middle of the room because the stuffed rabbit resting on Benny's pillow was not the same rabbit he had seen that morning on the kitchen island. Sam picked Mabel up. The right ear, the one that had been hanging by 3 thin threads for the past 2 months, the one Sam had kept promising to sew, and had never once found 15 quiet minutes to sit down and mend, had now been stitched back in place. Not the kind of hurried sewing he would have done with white thread, the kind with big uneven stitches and little crooked ones, the work of an exhausted father patching a toy at midnight. This was a scene done in black thread, tiny stitches, even, precise, running along the edge of the ear from base to tip, with such perfect spacing that Sam, who had once been a trainee nurse and had once watched surgeons close wounds in the emergency room, knew at once that this was the stitching of someone who knew how to hold a surgical needle. Mabel's right leg, where the stuffing had been spilling out that morning, had been filled again and neatly closed with the same kind of black thread, the same exact pattern of precise stitches. But the thing that made Sam sit down on the edge of the bed was the bow. Around Mabel's neck was a small bow made of black fabric tied neatly, and Sam knew at once that it wasn't made from ordinary cloth. It was soft, smooth, with a faint silken sheen. And when he looked closer, he saw that the edge of the fabric had been cut with sharp scissors in a line so straight it was almost unnerving. The bow had been cut from something expensive. Something people did not use to tie around the neck of a stuffed rabbit, and Sam had the strange feeling that he knew where it had come from, even though he couldn't prove it. He found Paul in the laundry room downstairs. The butler was folding handkerchiefs, and when Sam held Mabel out to him, Paul stopped, looked at the rabbit, looked at the black stitching, looked at the bow, and stayed silent for a moment. In the way Sam had learned meant Paul was deciding how much he ought to say. "Ms. Vance has a personal sewing kit," Paul said at last, his voice flat, his eyes returning to the pile of handkerchiefs. "A medical kit, curved needles, surgical thread, clamps, the whole thing. She learned how to stitch wounds very early." He paused. And Sam understood that the words "very early" and the past Paul did not speak aloud carried far more weight than anything he should ask about. "Never seen her use it on a stuffed rabbit before," Paul added softly, and went back to folding the handkerchiefs. Sam stood there in the laundry room, holding Mabel, looking at the careful black stitches along the rabbit's ear, the black silk bow around her neck, the leg that had been rested with a tenderness no one had asked for, and no one would thank her for, except a 3-year-old boy who would squeal with delight when he woke and saw that Mabel had been made well again. And Sam understood with that slow, heavy understanding that settles in the center of the chest instead of the mind, that the woman who sat behind the mahogany desk in the room everyone was afraid to enter, the woman who had learned to stitch wounds very early for reasons Paul would not name, the woman whose silence could empty a room faster than a loaded gun, had sat down at some point between morning and afternoon, taken out her surgical kit, and stitched Mabel's ear back together. Then she had cut a piece from one of her own handkerchiefs and tied it into a bow. She wasn't only his employer. Sam still didn't know what she was, but she wasn't only his employer. 1 week later, Regina left the estate early in the morning for a meeting that Paul referred to only as outside business. In that same flat tone he always used when speaking of anything connected to the other half of his employer's life, the half he had chosen not to look at. And Sam was assigned to clean the vault. The second time he had stepped into that room, but the first time without Regina sitting behind the desk. Without her in it, the room looked entirely different. Smaller, less heavy. Sam opened the curtains and let the sun in. And the October light fell across the mahogany desk, the way light falls across something being exposed for the first time, dust drifting in the air, everything looking more ordinary, more like the office of an ordinary woman. Until Sam pulled open the right drawer to wipe the inside and a photograph slipped out. It fell face down onto the wooden floor. Sam bent to pick it up, turned it over, and the world he had been living in changed completely in the space of time it took him to understand what he was looking at. It wasn't a family photograph. It wasn't a wedding picture like the one hanging in the hallway. It was a crime scene photograph. Carter Vance lay on the pavement, his blonde hair spread across the concrete, his eyes closed, and the white button-down he was wearing was soaked red from the chest downward in a way that Sam, who had once been a trainee nurse, recognized at once as not the result of one wound, but many. The kind of image he had seen in emergency room files beneath the words "gunshot victim." And in Carter's arms, pressed against his chest, shielded by his body like a barrier, was Nolan, a newborn, eyes closed. Alive. Sam set the photograph down on the desk with both trembling hands and stood there for he didn't know how long. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 3 minutes, while his mind rearranged everything that had never quite fit before and now fit perfectly in a way he wished it didn't. Paul had said Carter died from heart complications. Paul had said Regina was a real estate and restaurant businesswoman. Paul had said the bodyguards were there because she was wealthy and wealthy people needed security. Sam had believed all of it because he had needed to believe it. Because believing was the only way he had been able to sleep each night in this house with 2 small children. He looked out the window. The October sun lay across the estate grounds. And now Sam saw everything he had chosen not to see for the past 3 months. 2 men at the front gate, black suits, arms crossed, sunglasses, standing with the posture of men who had been trained, not hired through a private security company. Cameras at every corner of the walls, along the fence line, at the side gate, at the kitchen entrance, more than any real estate businesswoman would ever need. The fence surrounding the property was not decorative iron, but tall black steel with what he now realized was electric wiring running along the top. This was not a businesswoman's house. This was a fortress. And a fortress is not built to keep the outside world out. A fortress is built because the outside world once got in and once killed someone. Sam put the photograph back into the drawer, pushed the drawer shut, and finished cleaning the room in silence, his hand wiping across the surface of the desk and passing over a scratch he didn't know the origin of, dusting the bookshelf that held volumes he did not want to know the contents of, and left the vault with his heart beating in the right rhythm, but in the wrong way. Beating in that way it does when you know something you can never unknow again. That night, he lay in bed in the dark, the lights off, his eyes open. Benny and Jenna slept in their little beds beside him. Benny hugging Mabel with the newly stitched ear and the black bow. Jenna lying on her back, breathing evenly. Though Sam knew she would wake in a few hours and lead her brother across the dark hallway of the house, he now knew for what it truly was. Through the baby monitor on the nightstand, he heard Nolan turn in his crib on the far side of the estate. And that tiny shifting sound inside the vast, silent house echoed like the loneliness of an 11-month-old child. Sam wanted to run. Every instinct inside him screamed, pack the bags, pick up the children, go out the door, drive away, go anywhere that isn't here. But where? Leaving the estate gates meant leaving the steel fence and the cameras and the 14 bodyguards. It meant becoming Sam Mercer again. No address, no job. With the $80,000 debt Tricia had left behind, owed to men who never called twice to collect, because the second time they didn't call, they came in person. Kane Preston was out there, and Regina Vance was in here. Sam lay in the dark and thought, I brought my children into the house of a killer. I looked at the bodyguards for 3 months and told myself it was protection. I looked at the cameras and told myself it was security. I looked at the electric fence and told myself wealthy people are cautious. I lied to myself every day because the truth didn't fit inside what I needed in order to survive. He closed his eyes, opened them again, stared at the ceiling. But that killer had stitched his son's rabbit's ear with surgical thread and tied a black silk bow around its neck. And there it still was, that contradiction. The woman at the mahogany desk with the crime scene photograph of her husband in the drawer, and the careful black stitching on the ear of a stuffed rabbit. 2 things that should not have existed inside the same woman, and yet did. And Sam lay there in the darkness between his sleeping children and didn't know what to do with that except keep breathing, keep staying, keep waking at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning and pour 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. A few nights later, Regina was walking down the east hallway close to midnight, her steps slow and silent in the way that had become her new habit since the night she first stood outside Nolan's door when she saw them. 2 small shadows moving ahead of her, about 10 steps away. Benny walking first in the star-printed pajamas that Regina could now recognize in the dark by the soft rustle of the fabric alone, and Jenna half a step behind. One hand holding her brother's, the other carrying Mabel. Benny turned into Nolan's room without hesitation. Practiced as someone following a path he had walked 100 times, and disappeared through the half-open door. But Jenna stopped. The girl stopped at the threshold, not turning around, but tilting her head slightly to one side. And Regina understood that she knew she was there. Just like before, Jenna knew. She always knew by means of a sense no child should have possessed, but did because her circumstances had forced her to. The sense of a guard, someone who counted footsteps in the dark and could tell which ones were safe and which ones weren't. Regina did something no one in her organization had ever seen her do. She sat down, not in a chair or on a stair. She sat down on the wooden hallway floor, her back against the wall across from Nolan's door, her legs stretched out in front of her, placing herself at eye level with a 5-year-old child. Regina Vance, the woman who ran half of Chicago's Underworld. The woman grown men lowered their heads to when they entered a room, sat on the floor in the middle of her own hallway and looked up at a little girl in navy blue sleep clothes holding a stuffed rabbit. Jenna turned around. She looked at Regina sitting on the floor, and something shifted on her face. Not a smile. Jenna didn't smile, but something softened, as if she had taken note that this woman had chosen to sit lower than her instead of standing over her. And she understood the meaning of that choice, even though she was only 5 years old. Jenna walked over, sat down beside Regina, placed Mabel on her lap, leaned back against the wall, and the two of them sat side by side in the dark hallway, listening to Benny's singing drifting out from Nolan's room. That familiar psalm without words, steady and soft. "You keep watch every night," Regina said. It wasn't a question. Jenna nodded. "Don't you sleep?" "I sleep after," Jenna said, her voice small but clear. The voice of a child telling the truth because she didn't know how to do anything else. "When he's done." Regina was quiet for a moment. "Why don't you let the grown-ups do it?" And Jenna turned her head and looked at her, looked straight at her. She didn't lower her eyes, didn't look away, didn't glance down the way most adults did when Regina Vance looked at them. The 5-year-old girl looked straight into the eyes of the Chicago Mafia boss with eyes far older than her age. Eyes that had watched her mother pack a backpack and walk out the door without looking back. Eyes that had learned the lesson no child should ever have to learn so early. "My mom said she'd take care of it, too," Jenna said. Then she left. The hallway fell silent. Benny's singing floated softly and steadily out of the room. Regina didn't look away. She took that blow, took it whole because it wasn't an accusation. It was the truth from the mouth of a child who had lived with that truth every day for 6 months and had built her entire small life around it. Grown-ups promise, grown-ups leave. So Jenna kept watch because Jenna didn't leave. "In not going anywhere," Regina said. She didn't say it loudly. She didn't say it in the commanding voice of a mafia boss giving orders or in the reassuring tone of an employer trying to calm someone down. She said it in the voice of a woman sitting on the floor beside a 5-year-old child in a dark hallway. And she said it as though she understood that those 4 words would only mean anything if she proved them every day from now on. And she was prepared to do exactly that. And she was saying them to this child before she said them to anyone else. Jenna looked at her. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, long enough to assess, to weigh, to compare these 4 words with the last time a woman had said something like that and then disappeared. Then Jenna nodded once, briefly, firmly. It wasn't a polite nod. It was the nod of someone accepting a contract. And inside that contract was a clause neither of them needed to speak aloud. But both of them understood that if Regina lied, if she left, if she became one more grown-up who disappeared, then Jenna would never trust anyone again. And that cost was greater than any debt Regina Vance had ever collected. At the end of October, Fiona Beckett knocked on the door of the vault at 10 o'clock at night with the expression Regina had learned to read over more than 10 years of working beside her. And that expression said this news wasn't urgent in the sense that someone was about to die, but urgent in the sense that there was a problem that needed to be handled before it became the kind where someone was about to die. "Someone's watching the estate," Fiona said, standing in front of the desk, arms folded, her voice low and precise in the way the right hand of a mafia boss reported everything. Not one word wasted, not one detail missing. "For 3 days now." A black sedan parked on Lake Shore Drive 200 meters from the main gate. They switched drivers every 8 hours. Professional, but not professional enough that I wouldn't notice. Regina didn't look up from the document in front of her. Who is it? Kane Preston. Now Regina looked up. Kane Preston was a name she knew well. Not because Kane was big enough to become a real threat to Regina's territory, but because Kane was dangerous in the most irritating kind of way. Small enough to be reckless, greedy enough not to know when to stop, and cruel enough to do the kind of work bigger bosses couldn't be bothered to dirty their hands with. Kane ran a loan shark network on the south side of Chicago. The kind of lending with no contracts, no paperwork, no court. The kind where interest was measured by the month and debt was collected in bone. What's that got to do with me? Regina said. Fiona was silent for one beat. The kind of silence Regina recognized as meaning she wasn't going to like what came next. It has nothing to do with you. It has to do with Sam Mercer. Regina set her pen down. His ex-wife, Fiona said, Tricia Mercer, gambling addict, borrowed $80,000 from Kane. Compounded interest by now could have doubled it. Tricia vanished 6 months ago and Kane couldn't find her, so Kane turned towards someone easier to find. Fiona paused. Sam didn't sign a single piece of paper. He doesn't owe Kane 1 cent under any law in the state of Illinois. But Kane doesn't operate under the law of the state of Illinois. Kane operates under the law of Kane. And under that law, the husband and children of the woman who borrowed the money are collateral. And Kane has just discovered that his collateral is living in Regina Van Cess' house. Regina sat still, her fingers tapped once against the surface of the mahogany desk. Twice, 3 times, slow and even. The rhythm Fiona knew well. The rhythm she used when she wasn't calculating whether she would act, but how. How much? Regina said. Principal was $80,000. With compounded interest, Fiona repeated. It could be $160. Pay it all tomorrow. Fiona didn't move, but her jaw tightened in that subtle way only someone who had stood beside Regina for more than a decade would notice. Boss, Fiona said, choosing her words carefully. Paying off a housekeeper's debt will send the wrong message to everyone. Kane will read it as weakness. The others will read it as. She hesitated. Regina looked at Fiona, only looked, didn't speak, didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't tilt her head. She only looked with those pale gray eyes that 10 years earlier had made a gang leader sign over territory without anyone having to draw a gun. Fiona went quiet. Pay it all, Regina said again, and each word landed on the mahogany desk like a stone dropped into still water. Then she picked up her pen, bent back over the document, and Fiona understood that the conversation was over. Fiona left the room. The door of the vault closed behind her. Regina sat alone beneath the murky yellow desk lamp, staring at the document in front of her without reading it. And she didn't call Sam upstairs to tell him that the debt he had carried on his back for 6 months, the debt that had kept him awake every night and pushed him into taking work as a housekeeper in a stranger's home and enduring everything he had endured, would disappear tomorrow. She didn't say anything because she didn't need him to know. She wasn't doing this so he would be grateful. She was doing it for a reason she still wasn't ready to name. A reason that lay somewhere between that Tumanudi Vensican video and the nod of a 5-year-old girl on the floor of a dark hallway. And she would leave that reason where? It was until she understood it, or until it grew large enough on its own that it could no longer be ignored. A few days later, Sam took the children to the supermarket on Halstead Street. Their weekly shopping trip that he tried to turn into something normal for Benny and Jenna. 1 hour outside the steel walls and cameras. 1 hour in which he could pretend they were an ordinary family buying milk and cereal and bananas on a Saturday afternoon. 2 bodyguards followed, but they kept their distance, one standing at the end of the produce aisle, the other near the entrance, close enough to react, but far enough that Sam could look into the refrigerator case full of fresh milk without seeing the reflection of a black suit in the glass. Benny sat in the cart, his legs swinging. Mabel beside him, leaning against a cereal box like a passenger on a train. And Benny was singing some song to Mabel about clouds and cookies that he had invented right there in aisle 7. His little voice just soft enough to make passing shoppers smile, and Sam felt his heart grow lighter by a small degree. Jenna walked beside the cart, one hand holding the hem of Sam's pants out of habit, her eyes sweeping the shelves and the strangers with the steady rhythm that had become reflex, and she was the first one to see the man. Sam didn't notice him right away. The man was standing at the end of the aisle beside the pasta sauce shelf, wearing a gray coat, his hair cut short and neat, a polite smile on his lips, looking like anyone you might see in a supermarket on a Saturday afternoon and never think twice about. But Jenna tightened her grip on the fabric of Sam's pants. And Sam looked down at his daughter and saw her body go rigid, her eyes fixed on the stranger with an intensity no ordinary child possessed. And Sam's instincts began screaming before his mind had time to understand why. "Sam Mercer," the man said, stepping 2 paces closer. His voice gentle and perfectly ordinary, the kind of voice practiced in the art of making people let their guard down. "In Kane. A friend of Trisha's." The name Trisha hit Sam in the chest like a physical blow. He froze, his hand gripping the shopping cart handle until his knuckles went white, and stared at the man smiling in front of him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The kind of smile he had once seen on the face of the attending physician the day he fired him. The kind of smile that says, "I'm being polite, but you should understand that this isn't a conversation you're entitled to refuse." "Trisha sends her regards," Kane said, his eyes moving from Sam down to Benny in the cart and then to Jenna beside him. And that glance passing over his 2 children made Sam want to be sick. "She misses the kids." Then Kane tilted his head slightly, gently, as if he were sharing some small secret between friends. "The debt is still there, Sam." "With interest." And Kane lowered his voice by another half tone. "Does your new boss know?" Benny stopped singing. He looked up at Kane from the cart, not afraid, but silent, and hugged Mabel tighter to his chest out of instinct, the way he always held things when the air around him changed. "And Jenna." Sam could feel his daughter's hand on the fabric of his pants, not trembling, not slack, but tight and steady. And when he looked down, he saw that Jenna was staring directly into Kane Preston's face, staring straight at him, not lowering her eyes, not looking away, not stepping half a pace back the way she did with most strangers. The 5-year-old girl stood beside a supermarket cart and looked at the loan shark boss of Chicago's South Side with eyes that said, "I see you. I know what you are, even if I don't know your name, and am not afraid of you, and you won't touch my father, and you won't touch my brother." Kane recognized that look. Sam saw his eyes stop on Jenna for 1 second longer than necessary, and the polite smile on his mouth tightened at the corner, only slightly, but enough for Sam to know that even Kane Preston recognized something unusual in the little girl staring at him without blinking. Then the shadow of a black suit appeared at the end of the aisle. Both bodyguards, no longer keeping their distance, were walking toward them with the quick, even stride of men trained to move toward trouble instead of away from it. Kane looked at them, then back at Sam, and the smile returned to his mouth, full, polite, and still nowhere near his eyes. "Nice to meet you," he said. "Give my regards to your boss." Then Kane turned past the pasta sauce shelf and disappeared at the end of the aisle with the easy steps of a man who wasn't in a hurry because he had already said everything he needed to say, and he knew every word would stay in Sam's mind all night long. Sam shook the whole drive home. His hands shook on the steering wheel, shook when he lifted Benny out of the car seat, shook when he led Jenna through the estate gate, and he was still shaking when he closed the bedroom door behind the 3 of them, leaned his back against it, closed his eyes, and listened to his heart beat out the question Kane had planted in his mind like a poisonous seed, leaving it there to grow in the dark. "Does your new boss know?" That night, after putting the children to bed, after checking the bedroom door lock twice and then a 3rd time, after sitting on the edge of the bed, watching Benny hold Mabel and Jenna lie on her back, breathing evenly with a peace Sam envied because he couldn't feel even 1% of it himself. Sam stood up, stepped into the hallway. Walked down the east corridor past Carter's wedding photograph, which he now couldn't look at without seeing the other photograph, the pavement photograph, the photograph of the white button-down soaked red, and he stopped in front of the black oak door of the vault, where yellow light leaked from beneath it, telling him she was still inside, and he knocked. No one knocked on the vault. In the 3 months Sam had lived here, he had learned that people did not knock on this room. People were summoned. People stood outside and waited. People stepped in when permitted and left when allowed. And between those 2 moments, people lowered their heads, or at least their eyes. Sam knocked 3 times, knuckles against oak, clear, without hesitation, because he had spent all his hesitation over the last 3 months when he chose not to see the bodyguards, not to ask about the cameras, not to wonder why this house had an electric fence. And now Kane Preston had stood 1 step away from his son in a supermarket on Halstead Street, and spoken Trisha's name the way one speaks the name of a debtor, and Sam had no strength left for hesitation. "Come in," Regina's voice said from inside. Sam pushed the door open and stepped in. Regina was sitting behind the desk lamp dim and yellow, the curtains drawn shut. Everything exactly the same as the first time he had entered this room, except for one thing. The first time he had entered because she called for him. This time he entered because he chose to. She looked up. If she was surprised to see him standing there at nearly 11 o'clock at night, eyes red, hands clenched at his sides, she didn't show it. "Who are you?" Sam said. It wasn't a polite question. It wasn't the voice of a housekeeper speaking to his employer. It was the voice of a father who had watched a stranger let his eyes pass over his 2 children in a supermarket aisle. And that voice had no room left for politeness. "Who are you, really?" Regina set her pen down. She looked at him. She didn't answer right away. And the silence stretched long enough for Sam to hear the ticking of the clock on the wall and the blood pounding in his ears. But he didn't step back, didn't lower his gaze, didn't fill the silence with apologies the way he had the last time he stood in this room, because last time he had been afraid of losing his job. And this time he was afraid of something much bigger. "I saw the photograph," Sam said. "Your husband in the desk drawer. That wasn't heart complications." Regina didn't move. "I saw the bodyguards," Sam continued, and his voice was steadier than he expected. Steady with the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose except the 2 children sleeping at the end of the hallway. "I saw the cameras at every corner, the electric fence. And today, Kane Preston approached my children in the supermarket and said my ex-wife's name and asked whether my new boss knew." He drew in a breath. "I need to know. What have I brought my children into?" Regina looked at him. For a long time. It wasn't the look of judgment or threat. It was the look of a woman deciding. And Sam realized she wasn't deciding whether to tell him or not. She was deciding how to tell him. Then she told him the truth. No excuses, no long explanation, no prettier version of the story. She said her real name in the world Paul had never spoken of. She said what she controlled in Chicago. She said how Carter died. 3 bullets, a sidewalk last November, aimed at her, hitting him instead. And she said it in the flat voice of a woman who had told this story to herself every night for 11 months until the words had lost all their sharp edges and still went on cutting inside her. She said Nolan was a possible target. She said the house was a fortress because it had to be a fortress. And when she had finished, she sat there waiting for Sam to react, waiting for him to be afraid or furious or turn and run out of the room and pack his bags. And she waited with the face of a woman who was used to people walking away after learning the truth about her. Sam stood there. He didn't run. He was processing, rearranging every piece of the last 3 months into a new picture he could no longer pretend not to see. And in the middle of that, he asked the question Regina had not expected. "What about Kane?" He said. "Kane won't touch you or the children," Regina said. And her voice changed. No longer flat now. Something hard beneath it. Something Sam recognized as not a promise, but a fact already enforced. The debt has been paid. Sam blinked. What? Trisha's debt. 80,000, I paid it last week. Sam opened his mouth and then closed it again. 80,000, the sum he had lain awake thinking about every night for 6 months. The sum that had driven him into taking a housekeeping job in a stranger's house so he could hide. The sum Kane had used to threaten him with that afternoon in the supermarket. That sum was gone last week. And Regina hadn't told him. Why? Sam asked, and his voice was a whisper. Regina was silent. Not the kind of silence of power she used to control a room. This was the silence of a woman searching for words for something she had never had to explain before. Perhaps because she had never done anything that required this kind of explanation. Because of your little girl, Regina said at last, and her voice was so low, Sam had to hold his breath to hear it. She stays awake, keeping watch every night in my house. 5 years old, she doesn't trust any grown-up to stay. She looked at Sam. I won't become one more grown-up who walks away. A few nights later, at the beginning of November, Sam sat on the steps leading down to the wine cellar at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. This had become his new habit since the night Kane appeared in the supermarket. Since the night he knocked on the door of the vault and heard Regina Vance tell him exactly who she was. Since he had learned the truth and chosen to stay, and still didn't completely understand why he had made that choice. On the nights when he couldn't sleep, he left his room after checking on Benny and Jenna one last time, and went down the wine cellar staircase in the west wing of the estate, where there were no cameras, no bodyguards, only darkness, and the smell of old oak from the wine barrels below. It had the particular silence of a place deep under the ground where he could sit and breathe without feeling as though any walls were watching him. He was sitting on the 4th step from the top, both arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes fixed on the darkness below the stairs when he heard footsteps above him. He recognized those footsteps. 3 months in the same house, and he had learned the rhythm of her walk without meaning to. The way you learn the sound of rain on the roof of the place where you live, not because you listen for it, but because it stays there until it becomes part of the space itself. Regina appeared at the top of the stairs. She stopped when she saw him. And in the faint light from the hallway above, Sam saw that she looked different at this hour. Her eyes more tired than they were during the day. Her jaw no longer tight, her shoulders no longer straight, looking like a woman who had just finished a phone call she hadn't wanted to make about things she hadn't wanted to do, but had done anyway. Because that was the world she had built, and she didn't know how to live outside it. She didn't ask what he was doing there. She didn't tell him he should go to bed. She sat down on the 4th step from the top beside him about a handspan away, and there was the faint scent of whiskey and the smell of expensive shirt fabric and something else Sam couldn't name but had begun to recognize as her scent. The Vance scent, when she wasn't being Regina Vance at all, but was only a woman sitting on a staircase at 1 in the morning because she couldn't sleep either. They sat in silence. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Silence that wasn't heavy. Not like the silence in the vault the first time he had stepped inside. Not the kind of silence used to control or judge, but the silence of 2 people who had already said the big things to each other, the truth about her, the debt, Kane, Carter, 3 bullets. And they were now sitting beside each other in the dark after the big things had already been spoken, and only the small and real things remained, and neither of them knew where to begin. I don't know what I'm doing, Sam said. He wasn't speaking specifically about any one thing. Not about the job or the children or staying in her house or the strange feeling growing in the center of his chest each time she sat in the kitchen drinking coffee at 5 in the morning. He meant all of it at once and none of it at once, and he knew she understood. Neither do I, Regina said. 3 words, light, true. And Sam turned his head to look at her in the dim darkness. And for the first time, he didn't see the Mafia boss, didn't see the master of the estate, didn't see the woman whose silence could empty a room. He saw a tired woman sitting on the staircase of her own wine cellar at 1 in the morning, admitting that she was lost, too. And that admission, simple and bare, and needing no further explanation, was the closest thing Regina Vance had ever allowed anyone to see. They didn't touch. Neither of them said anything more. They simply sat side by side on the stair in the dark. Two people who had lost their way and had not yet found a new one. And only that sitting beside someone in the dark without having to explain why you were there was enough for tonight. November changed the house in ways no one could measure. Not through any great event or clear decision, but through things so small you didn't realize they were happening until you looked back and saw that everything had become different. Coffee at 5 o'clock in the morning became a ritual. No one declared it a ritual. No one said, "Tomorrow I'll come down to the kitchen again," or "Tomorrow I'll pour 2 cups instead of 1. It simply happened. Every morning, Sam standing in the kitchen and Regina appearing in the doorway and 2 cups of coffee set on the marble island, and the two of them drinking in easy silence or in brief conversations about the weather or about Nolan teething or about Benny announcing that Mabel wanted to eat a pancake. The kind of small ordinary conversation they both knew was extraordinary. Because nothing was ordinary about the Mafia boss of Chicago drinking coffee at dawn with her housekeeper in her own kitchen. Then Benny appeared every morning, star pajamas, curls exploding. Mabel tucked under one arm. And the first part of every morning became Mabel's health report. Mabel's stomach hurt. Mabel hadn't slept well. Mabel wanted milk, but she didn't have a real mouth, so Benny had to drink it for her. And Regina listened every morning with complete seriousness, tipping her head slightly when Benny spoke, nodding when he paused to take a breath, asking the next question with the same expression she used when Fiona reported on territorial matters. And Benny answered with the gravity of a department chief physician. And every morning, Sam stood on the other side of the kitchen island watching this exchange, and feeling something shift inside his chest that he didn't dare look at directly. One evening in the middle of November, Benny decided to teach Regina how to sing. He stood in the middle of the living room, Mabel in his arms, Nolan in the portable crib beside the sofa, and announced that she needed to learn the lullaby because Nolan liked singing and she sang it wrong. "She's never sung to Nolan before," Sam said gently from the armchair in the corner of the room. Benny looked at his father with the patient expression of someone forced to explain the obvious to grown-ups. "Right, so she needs to learn." Regina, sitting on the sofa, looked at the 3-year-old boy commanding her with absolute authority, and she didn't refuse. Benny sang first, the homemade song with no real words, only the humming melody he had sung to Nolan for 23 nights, and by now it had been more than 23 nights. And he motioned for Regina to repeat it. Regina repeated it. Her voice was low and heavy and completely off rhythm, like the sound of a truck engine trying to imitate a bird. And Benny frowned. "Not like that. Softer. Nolan likes soft." Regina tried again. "Softer." "Still wrong." Benny corrected her. Patient but strict. His little voice carrying the authority of a vocal teacher with 40 years of experience tucked inside the body of a 3-year-old. And Regina, the woman who made all of Chicago's underworld bow its head, adjusted her voice at his command. On the 3rd try, she sang it almost right. Benny nodded, not fully satisfied but willing to accept it. And Nolan in the crib let out a little babbling sound that Benny translated immediately as Nolan saying she sang it sort of okay. In the 2nd week of November, Regina held Nolan. It wasn't the first time she had held her son, but it was the first time she had held him in front of anyone else. Before that, she had only held Nolan alone in his room late at night when no one was watching, holding him with the rigid care of a woman afraid she might break the thing in her arms. But that morning in the kitchen, Nolan reached toward her from Sam's arms, his tiny fingers opening and closing, and Regina held out her hands to take her son without thinking, by instinct. And she lifted Nolan up, and Nolan laid his head on her shoulder, and Benny clapped. Jenna, sitting at the kitchen table, nodded. The distance between Jenna and Regina narrowed every day through November, and no one counted it. In the first week, Jenna sat at the end of the table. In the second week, Jenna sat in the middle of the table. In the third week, one morning, Sam looked up from his coffee cup and saw Jenna sitting right beside Regina, the girl's shoulder nearly touching her elbow, and she was eating cereal with the calm ease of someone who had sat there her whole life. Regina began reading to Nolan in the evenings, awkwardly at first, stiffly, her voice too serious, and her pacing too fast, the kind of reading done by someone following an instruction manual instead of telling a story. Benny sat beside her and corrected her. "You have to do the rabbit's voice. The rabbit talks small, not like that." The book Benny chose was the one about the rabbit who got lost trying to find the way home. And when Sam asked why that one, Benny said, "Because it's like Mabel," and offered no further explanation. Nolan touched the book cover with one finger and demanded it again every time Regina closed it. And she read it 14 times in 2 weeks. And she felt happy instead of tired. And that alone was a miracle. One afternoon in the kitchen, Paul stood washing cups beside Fiona, who was waiting for coffee, and he said softly without looking up, "Something's happened to her. I don't know what it is, but I pray it lasts." Fiona looked out the kitchen window where Regina was sitting in the yard with Nolan in her lap, and Benny was trying to teach Mabel how to wave hello while Jenna sat beside them reading the book about the lost rabbit that she now knew by heart. "It'll last," Fiona said, and she said it in the voice of a woman who wasn't hoping, but knew. At the end of November, Kane Preston played his final move. The debt had been paid off in full by Regina, which meant Kane had lost his financial leverage. And for a man like Kane, losing leverage didn't mean stopping. It meant finding another kind. And the leverage Kane found was Tricia Mercer. Fiona brought the news to Regina on Monday morning, her voice flatter than usual, which meant the news was worse than usual. Kane had found Tricia in a motel outside Milwaukee, paid off the rest of her gambling debt, bought her a suit, hired her a lawyer, and brought her back to Chicago with one purpose only: to file in Cook County Family Court for custody of Jenna and Benny Mercer. Tricia showed up at the estate gate that afternoon, thinner than Sam remembered, cheekbones jutting beneath ashen skin, but wearing a new suit with a lawyer standing beside her. And when the guard at the gate called into the house to say that a woman named Tricia Mercer was asking to see her ex-husband, Sam was standing in the kitchen cutting fruit for the children's afternoon snack. The knife slipped from his hand and struck the tile floor with a sharp clatter that made Benny lift his head from Mabel and Jenna spring up from her chair. Sam didn't collapse all at once. He collapsed slowly. The quiet kind of collapse that happens from the inside. The kind where outwardly he was still standing, still breathing, still able to tell Paul to keep the children in the kitchen and not let them go outside, while inwardly everything was falling. Because he understood American law well enough to know that Tricia was their biological mother. That biological mothers had rights. That he was a former nurse who had been fired with a stain on his record before the State Board of Nursing. That he was living in the home of a mafia boss, even if on paper she was a restaurant and real estate businesswoman. But if Tricia's lawyer dug deep enough. And that he had no money to hire a lawyer to fight a custody petition being funded by Kane Preston. Jenna stood beside the kitchen window. She looked out across the yard at the woman standing at the gate in a suit that didn't fit. And Sam waited for the girl to be afraid, or to cry, or at least to tremble. But Jenna turned and looked at her father with a calm face so steady that Sam wanted to fall to his knees, hold her, and apologize for allowing the world to take his daughter's childhood from her. "Dad," Jenna said, her voice clear, not shaking. "I'm not going with Mom." Then, as if it were only natural to add the next part, "Benny isn't either." Benny sat in his high chair, hugging Mabel tighter to his chest. The black bow at the rabbit's neck pressed beneath his chin. And though he didn't understand what was happening, he understood that his sister was serious. And when his sister was serious, he became serious, too. So he sat still and held Mabel and waited. Regina knew within 4 minutes. She made 2 phone calls. The first was to Margaret Chen, the best family lawyer in Chicago. The kind of lawyer who was completely clean, unconnected to anything from the other half of Regina's life, the kind of lawyer Cook County Family Court judges respected and juries trusted. And she said 3 sentences to her. "I need you to represent Sam Mercer in a custody dispute. I'll cover every cost. Start today." The second call was to Fiona. Shorter. Fiona understood. Within 48 hours, an anonymous source delivered to the Chicago office of the FBI a detailed packet on Kane Preston's financial operations, loan shark ledgers, laundering accounts, debtor lists. Enough to open a federal investigation. And Kane Preston, who had played chess with other people's lives for 20 years, woke up that Wednesday to FBI agents knocking on his front door at 6 in the morning and suddenly had bigger problems than threatening the ex-husband of a runaway debtor. Tricia lost Kane, lost the lawyer Kane had paid for, lost the suit Kane had bought, lost everything except herself, and Tricia Mercer had never been enough for anything. She stood at the estate gate one last time on Thursday afternoon, no suit, no lawyer, just herself in an old hoodie with the posture of a woman who had lost every hand she had ever played and still returned to the table because she didn't know how to do anything else. Regina walked out. The two women stood facing each other on the stone path in front of the estate. And Regina didn't threaten her, didn't raise a fist, didn't signal to the guards. She simply stood there and spoke in an even voice. The voice of a woman stating fact rather than opinion. Her daughter stays awake every night keeping watch. 5 years old. She stays awake because she doesn't believe any adult will remain. You did that to her. Regina looked at Tricia, and there was no cruelty in that gaze. None of the cruelty Tricia was surely expecting. There was something worse than cruelty in it. There was understanding. The understanding of a mother who had nearly become that same kind of absent parent to her own son before a 3-year-old boy in star-printed pajamas forced her to look again. Now you leave, Regina said. This time, willingly. Tricia stood there. She looked at Regina. Then she lifted her eyes toward the house, toward the second-floor window. And there, behind the glass, Jenna was standing and looking down. One hand holding Benny's, her face expressionless, her eyes unblinking. And Tricia looked at her daughter one last time through the window of the house she would never be allowed to enter. Then she turned, shoved her hands into the pockets of her hoodie, and walked down the stone path, through the gate, and out to the road. And this time, when she disappeared for real. Not like smoke slipping through a crack in the door, but like something heavier, slower, sadder. Like the final person to understand that she had never been enough for what she left behind. The night after Tricia walked away, Regina stood outside Nolan's bedroom door, as had become her habit every evening, leaning against the doorframe, eyes closed, listening to Benny sing beneath the pale yellow moonlight. And she realized that something was different. It wasn't the song. Benny was still singing that homemade melody, still steady, still soft, still so serious it was almost ceremonial. What was different was the missing sound. There was no quiet, even breathing from the floor beside the door. No soft rustle of sleep clothes brushing the wall each time the girl shifted her weight. Jenna was not in her place on watch. Regina opened her eyes and looked down at the spot that for so many nights had belonged to Jenna, the right side of the doorway, back against the wall, Mabel in her lap, eyes open, watching the hallway. And that spot was empty. Regina leaned and looked through the narrow opening of the half-open door, and what she saw made her grip the doorframe harder. Jenna was standing beside the crib. Beside Benny. The girl was no longer sitting at the door. She had left her guard post, crossed the room, and come to stand beside her brother in front of the crib where Nolan lay sleeping, and she was singing. Jenna's voice was small, shaky, awkward in a way Benny's voice never was because Benny had been born singing the way other children were born breathing. But Jenna was not Benny. Jenna was the little girl who had assigned herself the duty of standing watch instead of singing, the duty of protecting instead of loving. Because 6 months earlier, when her mother had walked away, she had decided that the world needed a guard more than it needed a song, and she would be the guard. But tonight, she was singing. The melody did not match Benny's rhythm. She was copying him, but copying him imperfectly. Half a beat behind, half a tone too high. And Benny did not correct her. He simply kept singing and let his sister's voice fold into his own. And those two children's voices, out of rhythm and out of tune, mingled beneath the moonlight, and created something that was not beautiful in the ordinary sense, but beautiful in the only sense that truly mattered. Beautiful because it was real, because it was imperfect, because it came from two children who had lost too much and still chose to stand in the dark and sing for a baby who was not their own. And Regina understood. She understood at once with that heavy understanding that strikes the center of the chest. Jenna had stepped away from her post. For the first time since Trisha walked out 6 months ago, the girl was not sitting at the door, not sweeping the hallway with her eyes, not guarding 2 directions at once, not holding Mabel like a soldier's weapon. She was standing beside her brother and singing because she trusted. For the first time, she trusted that someone was keeping watch outside the door for her. That someone would not leave, that someone had said, "I'm not going anywhere," on the floor of a dark hallway, and had kept that promise every day since then. Through coffee at 5 in the morning, and a rabbit's ear stitched with black thread, and 14 readings of the book about the lost rabbit, and 80,000 paid without needing anyone's gratitude, and a single sentence spoken to Trisha Mercer at the front gate that made her walk away for the last time. Jenna had lowered her guard, and she sang. Regina stood in the doorway, one hand on the wood, and she did not move, did not breathe too hard, only stood there and watched the 5-year-old girl sing in that trembling, awkward voice beneath the moonlight and felt something inside her chest. Something that had first cracked open the morning she watched the Tumanidiandal Avensican video, now break apart completely. Not painfully, not sharply, simply opening like a door that had been locked for a very long time, and was finally pushed wide and flooded with light. Then she sensed someone behind her. She turned her head. Sam was standing in the dark hallway, 2 steps behind her, one hand over his mouth, eyes wet, tears slipping through his fingers down to his wrist, and he was looking into the room over her shoulder, looking at his daughter standing beside the crib and singing. His daughter, the little girl who had not slept through a single night in 6 months because she did not believe anyone would stay. And tonight, that little girl was singing instead of standing guard. And Sam was crying without a sound because he understood what it meant, and it was bigger than any words he had. Regina lifted her hand slowly, carefully in the way she would never lift a hand toward anyone in her world because in that world a raised hand meant threat. But this was not that world. This was the dark hallway outside her son's room where 2 children were singing and the man standing before her was crying. And she lifted her hand slowly and placed her thumb against Sam's cheek and wiped away a tear. That was all, her thumb against his cheek. Light, warm, 3 seconds. Then she lowered her hand. She did not kiss him. She did not hold him. She did not pull him closer. She did not say a word. One finger wiping away tears in the dark. And it carried more weight than any declaration Regina Vance had ever spoken because she was a woman who used her hands to control an empire, to sign orders, to hold a gun. And tonight she used that same hand to wipe tears from the face of the man standing in the hallway of her house. And they both knew that something had just begun that could not yet be named, and did not need to be named, because it had been there from the first cup of coffee at 5 in the morning, from the night she sat beside him on the wine cellar stairs and said, "Neither do I," from long before tonight, and it would remain long after tonight, and now it only needed time. In the middle of December, one evening, Sam passed by Nolan's room and stopped. He hadn't meant to stop. He was on his way back to his room after finishing the dinner dishes, tired in that pleasant way that comes after living through an ordinary day inside a house that had begun to feel ordinary. But the light spilling through the narrow crack of the half-open door drew him back. The soft, pale gold light of the moon lamp Carter had bought before Nolan was born, the lamp Regina had nearly thrown away 3 times and kept because it was the last thing her husband's hands had placed in that room. And now that light fell across a scene that no one in this house could have imagined 4 months ago. Regina was sitting in the rocking chair. Nolan lay in her arms, his head resting against her chest, his eyes slowly drifting shut, and the way she held her son had changed completely from those first times. No longer stiff, no longer afraid, but easy, natural, the way a mother holds a child after she has stopped looking at him through bulletproof glass and has begun to gather him to herself with both arms. And Nolan curled into her chest with the absolute, complete trust of a baby who knows he is in the safest place in the world. On the floor beside the rocking chair, Benny sat cross-legged with Mabel in his lap, the ears stitched back together with black surgical thread, and the black silk bow still tied around her neck. And Benny was telling a story. His voice was low and steady. The bedtime storyteller's voice he had perfected over the past several weeks. And by now, the story had grown into something grand in the way only the imagination of a 3-year-old can make grand things. There was a moon. There was a rabbit named Mabel. Because of course there was. There were clouds that tasted like birthday cake, and Benny insisted they tasted like chocolate because that was the only kind clouds liked. There was a star named Wendy who was the moon's best friend. And there was a bear who worked as a detective and specialized in finding lost things. And that bear detective had found all sorts of things, had found the key the star dropped, had found the song the cloud forgot, had found the road home for the rabbit. And on the other side of the rocking chair, Jenna sat on the floor with her back resting against one of its legs and her eyes were closed. Sam had to look twice to be sure. Jenna's eyes were closed. The girl was asleep. For the first time, the very first time since the night Tricia walked away 6 months earlier, the first time since Jenna had assigned herself the duty of keeping watch. Every night, Jenna had refused to fall asleep before making sure everyone was safe. She had never fallen asleep before Benny. She had never fallen asleep before Nolan. She was asleep with her back against the leg of the rocking chair where Regina sat, her breathing deep and even. And her right hand. Sam could see it clearly in the moonlight. Her right hand was holding the hem of Regina's pants, holding it lightly, holding it the way she always held the hem of Sam's clothes whenever she walked beside her father. The grip of a child hanging on to the person she trusted not to disappear when she closed her eyes. Regina didn't move. She sat absolutely still in the rocking chair. Nolan on her chest. And she didn't shift her leg, didn't lift her hand, didn't move even an inch. Not because she was afraid of waking Jenna, but because she didn't want to lose that feeling, the feeling of a tiny 5-year-old hand holding onto her trouser leg in sleep. The feeling of being trusted by the child who had decided no one was worthy of trust, and she had proven otherwise. Every day, every cup of coffee, every black stitch in the rabbit's ear, every book she read aloud, every time she sat down on the floor so she'd be level with the little girl's eyes. Until tonight, when Jenna had finally closed her eyes first and lowered her guard. Benny kept talking in that soft, steady whisper. And the story reached the part where the rabbit stood on a hill and looked up at the moon. And the rabbit said to the moon, "You're my best friend." And the moon said, "I know. Eve always known. I was only waiting for you to say it." Nolan let out a soft little breath. His eyes closed all the way. His tiny chest rose and fell in the rhythm of deep sleep. The sleep of a child who no longer cried every night until he wore himself out because someone had sung to him, had tucked the blanket around him, had laid a hand on his back and stayed there until he didn't need it anymore. Regina looked down at her son's face and the expression on her face. Sam saw it from the doorway. Wide open, unguarded, stripped of every layer of armor she had worn for 36 years. It looked like the face of a woman seeing the thing she loved most in the world for the first time without any glass between them. And it was so bright that Sam had to turn away for 1 second. Then he looked back. Benny lifted his head. His big brown eyes found Sam in the doorway with that strange accuracy children have when they always know exactly where their father is in any room. "Dad," Benny whispered. "Nolan's asleep." "I see, buddy," Sam whispered back. "And Jenna's asleep, too," Benny added, looking over at his sister, leaning against the rocking chair leg with the gentle satisfaction of someone watching another person finally rest after a very long shift. "She's not guarding anymore." Silence. Then Regina spoke very quietly, her eyes never leaving Nolan. "Because I am." Benny looked at Regina, nodded. "Serious." "Because you are." Sam stood in the doorway and felt something large and quiet settle inside his chest. Not happiness, or not only happiness, but something wider than that, something that felt like the first page of a story worth reading. He thought of the man he had been 4 months earlier. The man driving his 8-year-old car up to the gates of this strange house with Benny asleep in the car seat and Jenna awake and watching beside him, and one bag in the trunk, and the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had been let down too many times to keep expecting anything else. He hadn't come here looking for anything but a paycheck and a safe place to sleep. He hadn't planned for Mabel, hadn't planned for Psalms in the kitchen, hadn't planned for the woman who had forgotten how to be human slowly, painfully, tenderly. Remembering again. He hadn't planned to stand in this doorway and feel that he was looking at something that belonged to him. Not the house, not the wealth, not anything he had never wanted and still didn't want, but the warmth, the impossible arrangement of these people in this room, this light, this story about the moon. Benny stood up with the careful movement of someone who considered a sleeping baby serious business. Walked to Sam, and Sam lifted him into his arms. Benny laid his head on his father's shoulder and yawned a long yawn that made Sam smile into his hair. Regina looked up. Her eyes found Sam's over Nolan's sleeping head. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The language they had built over these months, built out of coffee at 5 in the morning, and a rabbit's ear stitched with black thread, and a song about the moon, and 2 minutes and 11 seconds of infrared video, and one finger wiping tears away in the dark, had gone beyond the need for words in moments like this. She looked at him the way you look at the person who helped you find your way back to yourself, with a gratitude too large to speak, and able to live only in the eyes. Sam held his son and looked back. Outside, the December sky was full of stars. Somewhere in the house, the clock struck 9. In Nolan's room, the baby slept in his mother's arms, dreaming whatever it is that an 11-month-old baby dreams. A 5-year-old girl had finally fallen asleep in peace. Not because danger was gone, but because for the first time, she believed that if danger came, someone else would stand between her and the dark. And a 3-year-old boy already half asleep on his father's shoulder let out a satisfied sigh, that deep, soft, boneless sigh of someone who had finished everything he came to do. He saw someone who needed a psalm. He sang. He saw people who needed a friend. He became one. He saw a house full of people who had forgotten how to find one another. And he walked straight through it with Mabel tucked under one arm, his sister holding one hand, and love in both of the hands he had left. And he found all of them. 3 years old, star pajamas, a stuffed rabbit sewn back together with black thread, a sister who never once looked away. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. And perhaps that is what this story wants to remind all of us. That sometimes the thing that heals the deepest wounds isn't money, isn't power, isn't high walls or steel fences or 14 bodyguards, but one tiny hand resting on someone's back in the dark and staying there until they fall asleep. That the greatest courage doesn't belong to the person holding the gun, but to the 5-year-old girl sitting watch at the door every night because she decided that was her job. That real love doesn't need declarations or drama or kisses in the rain. It only needs someone to show up every day, quietly, patiently, and stay. If this story touched something inside you, if you saw yourself in Sam or in Regina, or in little Jenna sitting guard at the door, or in little Benny singing to strangers because he believed everyone needed a psalm, then please like this video, share it with someone you think needs to hear this story tonight, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories. We'd truly love to hear from you. What did this story make you think of? Who in your life did it remind you of? Which moment in the story touched you the most? Please leave a comment below because every comment you leave is how we know these stories are reaching the hearts they were meant to reach. And nothing is more precious than hearing what you truly feel deep in your own heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and calm beside the people you love. Goodbye, and they'll see you in the next video.